it's Julie Spencer, author of the Buxton Peak series, and we are just starting into Buxton Peak Book 3, which is called The End of the Beginning. I hope that you've had a chance to read the first two books in this series, but if you haven't, I've been told that Book 3 can stand alone as a story that you will be able to understand without having read the first two. But this is Book 1, Buxton Peak Book 1, Who is Ian Taylor? And then there's Book 2, which is called Buxton Peak Center Stage. And then we'll be starting into Book 3. But I wanted to also tell you about a couple other projects. This anthology collection called Unspoken Words actually has a section in it that is a short story I wrote that actually takes place in the middle of Buxton Peak Book 3. So when we get to that point, I will point it out to you and let you know about it. But highly recommend this anthology because it is a collection of short stories written by quite a few of some of my favorite authors, and I love for you to get to have the chance to be introduced to them as authors. So if you have a chance to read it, it's called Unspoken Words. It is a collection anthology by the LDS Beta Readers Group. So highly recommend it. It's available on Amazon. Okay, the other book in the Buxton Peak series is Buxton Peak The Early Years, which is a prequel to my trilogy and probably one of my favorite books that I've ever written. So we've got trilogy, the prequel, and then a short story. And I also have started writing a couple other parts of Buxton Peak, including a bridge between Book 2 and Book 3 called London Bridges, in which you actually have the opportunity to meet one of the characters that is quite prominent in Buxton Peak Book 3, and that is Vanessa. And you have not met her in any of the previous trilogy, but you'll meet her probably in Chapter 1 for sure. I was going to say Page 1, but I think it's just Chapter 1. So you'll meet Vanessa in the book called London Bridges, but I'm not done writing it yet, so sorry. Hopefully soon. Okay, let's get into Buxton Peak Book 3, The End of the Beginning. And the Chapter 1 is called Conversation with a Side of Drumsticks. Does this guy even know we're coming to his concert tonight? Ian asked. The waitress had yet to take their orders, but Ian wanted to get down to the real reason they were meeting. He hadn't been together with his band members in months, but they weren't there to have a nice meal with their best girls. This was business. Andy shrugged and raised his eyebrows. I've never actually met him. What? Ian leaned forward and pushed his hands against the table, gripping the tablecloth. How do you know he's a good drummer if you've never heard him play? He plays at their church worship services on Sundays. He's like a minister or something. Andy brushed his shaggy bangs off his forehead, and Ian couldn't help notice how clear Andy's eyes were and how clean he looked. Obviously, the stylist had recently gotten her hands on Andy's hair. Ian was reminded how long it had been since anyone had worked over him. All the guys tended to let the stylist have free rein with purposely random highlights and just the right amount of length to keep them looking like the rock stars that they were. Andy had only lived in Nashville for a few weeks, and it surprised Ian that Andy was attending a church at all. His new girlfriend seemed to be a good influence. Nashville was a good situation all around. Andy needed to get away from the negative influences back in England, where he originally became involved in drugs. When Ian found out Andy met a new drummer, Ian chartered a jet faster than he could pack. They would worry about bringing their furniture down from Michigan later. Ian loved Nashville the minute he arrived. So this drummer just plays in a little church band? Kai shook his head and mumbled under his breath. What are we doing here? Tonight there's a real concert at their church, Andy said. There will be hundreds of people in attendance. We're used to playing for thousands, Kai reminded Andy, leaning forward and creasing his eyebrows. This guy's not even in our league. You willing to go back to London and reconcile with Gary? Andy narrowed his eyes at Kai. Because the last time I saw him, he was heading back into rehab. I doubt he'll be practicing his drums while he's there. Not to mention, there's a little issue with him having given drugs to your girlfriend. Have you forgiven him yet? Kai glanced over, met Rhonda's eyes, and looked down at their baby. A few months ago, baby Sean had been delivered 7 weeks early. He almost died because of the drugs Gary gave to Rhonda. No, it wouldn't be easy for Kai to forgive Gary, no matter how badly the band needed a drummer. Ian pulled the conversation back to the task at hand. Okay, so Buxton Peak is shy one drummer, and we all agree we're not bringing Gary back on board. Ian raised his eyebrows and looked pointedly at Kai and then Andy. Ian already knew the answer, but it was just a formality anyway. Ian Taylor owned Buxton Peak. The band, the name, all of their songs. If he wanted a new drummer, he would hire a new drummer. If he wanted to replace Andy as their bass guitar, he would. He would never consider replacing Kai as their lead guitar. But the other guys were expendable, and they all knew it. We gave Gary an ultimatum. Get cleaned up or leave the band, Ian said. Gary made his choice. We're making ours. Let's just show up at Nathaniel's concert tonight and see if he's a good fit. So what? We're just going to walk up and steal their drummer? Kai sounded concerned, but there was a gleam in his eyes. Ian half expected him to reach over and offer a fist bump. Kai knew Ian better than anyone else in the world, probably even better than his wife Megan, although Ian would never admit that. He wrapped his arm around the back of Megan's chair and grinned at Kai. Kai Burton was Ian's best friend since primary school. He was also one of the most talented guitar players Ian had ever met. Kai and Ian worked together to build Buxton Peak into the megastars they were. They'd been through a lot together and had a nonverbal communication that surpassed most usual relationships. Together, they would find a way to pull their band back together. Nathaniel's a youth pastor, Vanessa drawled, her southern accent a stark contrast to the guy's British dialects. Ian understood why Andy was drawn to her. She was adorable. Ditzy, but adorable. I've known him and his wife for years. They have the sweetest little girl. With longing in her eyes, Vanessa looked down at baby Sean resting in Rhonda's arms. Ian was waiting for Vanessa to beg Andy for a puppy the same way a child would... Excuse me, I read that wrong. Ian was waiting for Vanessa to beg Andy for a baby the same way a child would beg for a puppy. Andy already seemed serious about Vanessa, although they'd only known each other for a few months. But he didn't seem to notice her distracted gaze. Andy was focused on music. The waitress interrupted with baskets of dinner rolls and their drinks. While the others took turns ordering food, Ian spread whipped butter on a warm roll and contemplated this turn of events. Ian had grown up as the lead singer and songwriter for Buxton Peak. He'd bonded with his bandmates like brothers, but they'd never shared the same values. Andy and Gary had spiraled out of control with drinking and drug abuse. Now Andy was a recovering addict and Gary was leaving the band. Andy's eyes were clear and confident. He seemed different. Sobriety suited him. Ian and Andy Smith had connected in their 7th year of school. He was talented on the bass guitar and a great pal. But when he and Gary had gotten involved in drugs and alcohol, it nearly destroyed their band. Gary hadn't stayed sober. It was too bad, because he was a great drummer. But a rock band as successful as Buxton Peak would bounce back without Gary Owens. This guy, Nathaniel, might be just what they needed. So, Ian forced the conversation back around after the waitress left. We're just going to show up tonight at his concert unexpectedly and go up to him afterwards, introduce ourselves and say, "Hey, want to get together and jam sometime, mate?" Is that the idea? Pretty much. Andy shoved a bite of roll into his mouth and nodded. That's not a bad way to interview someone, Kai pointed out. If he doesn't know we're there, he'll just be acting normal and not trying to show off. You know what I mean? They all nodded in unison. This could get interesting. We sort of stand out, Megan whispered, pulling Ian's arm as they climbed out of the car. Ian tucked her hand into the crook of his elbow as if he were escorting a queen to a royal ball rather than walking together into an inner-city non-denominational church in the heart of Nashville. It wasn't huge, but bigger than most churches Ian and Megan attended. I've gotten rather used to rural Michigan. It is different seeing people do a double take when they recognize us, Ian acknowledged. No one paid us much attention in Mount Pleasant, Michigan anymore. That's because we haven't been together in almost a year, Kai said. He hoisted Sean's baby carrier over his arm and handed the diaper bag to Rhonda. "I'm afraid we're going to start needing bodyguards again." Ian sighed. They still weren't together. They were missing Gary. He wondered if they ever would be together again. "Bodyguards? We're not a scary church," Vanessa pouted. "I mean, look at all the beautiful diversity of people stepping through those doors. Young, old, all colors and nationalities, rich and poor, and even a couple of rock stars." Vanessa poked Andy in the side and winked at him. He pulled her close and planted a kiss on her forehead. It was nice to see Andy so happy. He deserved some happiness. "All churches are scary to me," Kai wrinkled his nose. "I don't believe in God." "Fear and faith cannot exist in the heart at the same time," Vanessa drawled. "You just need to have some faith and you won't be afraid anymore." "Not happening anytime soon," Kai said, rolling his eyes. He held the door for Rhonda and everyone else tucked in behind her. Ian brought up the rear of the group and patted Kai on the shoulder. "Someday," Ian whispered. "Don't count on it, preacher boy," Kai said. "Let's sit in the very back and hopefully no one will notice us," Ian said. "Yeah, too late. Well, hopefully no one will tell Nathaniel we're here anyway." The band was warmed up and ready to begin. People on the stage came and went, adjusting cords and wires, conversing with one another. The whole scene was casual, laid back, and relaxed. It was worlds away from a stadium concert with 50,000 screaming fans. "That's him at the drums," Andy whispered, nodding in the direction of the stage. A tall black man with a friendly smile and stocky shoulders sat behind an elaborate drum set. "He's a right big bloke," Ian said. "He looks like he could handle himself in a rugby scrum." Teenagers surrounded Nathaniel, and he seemed to enjoy their attention. He smiled and laughed and gave them random fist bumps. Youth pastor, that's right, Vanessa had mentioned it. Ian was drawn to him immediately, but followed his little group to the back of the auditorium-style worship center and took a seat. Once the first song began, Ian couldn't sit still. Before he realized what was happening, he was standing against the back wall with his head close together with Kai and Andy. "He's good," Kai whispered. "Really good." Ian nodded in time with the beat. "Their bass player's better than I am," Andy acknowledged. Both Ian and Kai looked over at Andy with raised eyebrows. "We're not looking to replace our bass guitarist," Ian said. "You planning on quitting anytime soon? I could go get the guy's number if you want." "I don't think I like the lead singer," Andy changed the subject. "He looks cocky and presumptuous. His facial expressions are over the top, like he's trying too hard to look like he's religious, but isn't as much as he pretends to be." Again, Ian and Kai raised their eyebrows at Andy. "That's deep analysis, pal." "I've just seen the difference," Andy shrugged and dismissed their scrutiny. "You don't try to be religious, Ian. God's light just shines through all you do. It always has." Ian couldn't form a coherent response to that. He just stared at Andy with his jaw slacked. "When did you start believing in God?" Kai asked. "I don't know," Andy shrugged. He scratched his head and looked away. "I'm not sure I do." "We'll talk another time," Ian told him, clapping him on the back. "For now, let's listen to our new drummer and his soon-to-be former bandmates." They turned their attention back to Nathaniel. Now that Andy had pointed it out, Ian could see what he meant about the lead singer. They were playing cover songs of inspirational Christian rock music. Ian recognized most of the songs, but the front man seemed to be trying too hard. With only 3 guys on the stage, the lead singer was also their lead guitarist. Their bass guitarist wore a cowboy hat and boots and looked more like he belonged in a country band than a Christian band. He seemed very young compared to the lead singer and Nathaniel. Andy was right. The bass guitarist was better than he was, but a lot of bassists were better than Andy. He wasn't the reason Buxton Peak was such a successful rock band, but they definitely weren't replacing him. Ian tried to evaluate Nathaniel from afar. He was probably in his mid to late 20s and wore a wedding ring. He was confident and talented, but obviously holding back. Ian wanted to hear him wail on those drums. Nathaniel was not meant to play in the back of this little Christian church. Ian pictured him in a stadium full of screaming fans, full out jamming on those drums. He felt drawn to this man in many ways. He sensed they were going to be great friends and kindred spirits. At intermission, people stood, stretched, conversed, and meandered to the tables with cookies and punch. Ian didn't budge and didn't take his eyes off Nathaniel. Kids and adults came and went. A little girl with cornrow braids ran onto the stage and climbed up on Nathaniel's lap. Ian assumed she was his daughter. A beautiful woman came up, kissed him, and picked the girl up from her daddy's arms. They talked for a moment, and then the girls walked away. The moment Ian had assumed would happen finally did. Someone whispered in Nathaniel's ear, and his head jerked around. Ian raised an eyebrow, and Nathaniel's eyes widened. He whispered back to the guy beside him. Ian could tell they were trying to hide their conversation from the other two guys in the band. Nathaniel knew exactly why the 3 remaining members of Buxton Peak were standing in the back of his sanctuary. Nathaniel took a drink from his water bottle and sat at the drum set, fiddling with his sticks. Ian half expected him to snap his fingers at the other band members and encourage them to get back into position and resume the show. Nathaniel's knee started bouncing, and he tatted his sticks lightly against the edge of his snare. It wasn't loud enough to get very many people's attention, but he wasn't playing for everyone. He was talking directly to the 3 guys standing in the back of the room with their arms crossed and light grins on their faces. Nathaniel tapped a little louder and with a bit more rhythm. It was obvious Nathaniel was showing off. Ian nodded just slightly in time with the drumsticks, and the conversation continued. Finally, the other band members strapped on their instruments and began the process of tuning the knobs and testing the strings. The audience members returned to their seats after throwing away paper cups of punch and napkins covered in cookie crumbs. The second half of the show did not disappoint. Nathaniel showed no sign of nervousness once the music started. He was in his element, in the same zone Ian performed in. He didn't seem to be overperforming, just playing exactly what he had rehearsed hundreds of times with his band. But he had more talent than the other 2 combined. They were holding him back in more ways than one. He was never going to make it out of Nashville playing with these guys in this small church, and he was never going to be able to play with his whole soul as long as he was sitting behind them. The concert ended with a moving ballad that showcased the lead singer's vocal abilities and all their love and devotion to God, but it didn't satisfy Ian's desire to see Nathaniel perform. The anticipation of hearing him play again was almost palpable. Ian couldn't wait to get him in a studio. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 1, and next we will start into chapter 2, which is called Scandalous.